welcome everyone. So great to see you all. But our guest today is Paul Austin, who is the author of Mastering Microdosing. And it's a book that both Corey and I really quite love. It is a book that we gave away at our last community event. And for integration is this idea of leaning on creating more, let's call it flexibility in our thoughts, more neurogenesis, more of the capacity to loosen the hold that our beliefs and ideas and ways of being have had on us. And microdosing is one of those tools. The connection experience, we love the magic that occurs in those experiences. We lead personal journeys. We love the magic that occurs there as well. But really, the work and the transformation and the difference happens in between. The dedication that we make to changing our life, our world, our relationships, our bedroom, our business, how we parent, all those things, that's where the game is won or lost, in our humble opinion, which is why Integrate exists. And Corey and I have been playing with microdosing, well, I guess off and on now for almost a year. It does take some time. Like, this is not one of those things that it's like, great, I did it 3 days and now I know what this is going to look like and what this is going to feel like. That's not how it goes. Finding the right dose is imperative. Finding the right medicine, like even I wanted to point this out, is that if those of you who have used psilocybin or even psilocin and it's not your thing, LSD is our preference in terms of this entire process. The LSD tincture drops make it, for me, cleaner and simpler. For Corey, less body reaction and load and all those pieces. There's a lot of ways to go about this, which is frankly why I invited Paul Austin to come speak with us about microdosing. They have incredible experience coming up, which is about 45 days of both education and a structured process to evaluate and keep an eye on this. First and foremost, if you are not already on the Third Wave email list, you must get on the Third Wave email list. Whenever I talk about Paul, I always describe him as one of the leading educators in the entire psychedelic field. And on a very personal note, I want to just say thank you, because Paul had Corey and I very early on in the connection experience, like very early on, had us on a podcast that got a tremendous amount of action and energy and interest from the United States, which we've been traditionally just serving, our smaller community here in Canada. So I want to say thank you for that. So on that note, so Paul is, of course, the author of Mastering Microdosing. He is the founder of the Third Wave. He was one of the early co-founders of I guess one of the earliest legal psilocybin treatment locations in the world, and has really been at the process of educating, inspiring, lobbying to make this space of psychedelic therapy, psychedelic healing, and psychedelic access available as broadly as possible in the world. So I just want to say, Paul, thank you for making time for being here. I deeply appreciate it. And for the rest of you, whatever you want to know in the world of microdosing and all of those pieces, pick on Paul's brain, because it is immense, and this is a fast-changing world. So please give Paul a great virtual round of applause and say thank you for being here at Integrate.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Corey, for creating this space. As Jay mentioned, I've been at this for a little bit. I've been myself working with psychedelics for about 15 years, since I was 19, largely in a responsible and intentional way. And then in 2015, I started to microdose. So for about the last 9 years, I've explored almost everything under the sun when it comes to microdosing protocols. Through Third Wave, we've had the great fortune of educating, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people on microdosing specifically. And what I love about microdosing, and why I'm actually here in California today, I'm in Sacramento. California is considering a bill to legalize the therapeutic use of psychedelics, and we're working to figure out how do we get a provision for microdosing integrated into that, so we can have a take-home model for psilocybin microdoses. And I think what's so powerful about microdosing is it's a great bridge for those who are pretty new to psychedelics. And I'll share a little bit about my personal background as it relates to this. So I grew up in a place called Grand Rapids. How many of you have heard of Grand Rapids in Michigan? All right. Nice. Okay. A handful of you. Great. So Amway and Steelcase and Herman Miller, and if you're into microbreweries, Founders and Bell's Brewery, right? There's a few of the local ones. So Grand Rapids is quite religious, quite traditional, and I grew up in a very traditional family. Not necessarily conservative. My mom was a progressive. My parents voted Democrat, but very sheltered. And at the age of 16, my parents found out that I had been smoking cannabis. And they sat me down one Sunday after church and basically were like, "We can't believe you did this. We're so disappointed." My dad looked at me and was like, "I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident, 30 years prior to that." So I grew up in this sort of set and setting, this context where psychedelics and generally these illegal drugs, plant medicines, were highly stigmatized. And for me, that never really made much sense. I was like, I don't get it. Like, I had a really beautiful experience with cannabis. I laughed a ton. I connected with my friends a lot. Like, I even at that point was definitely struggling with mood and depression, and it just sort of helped me to connect a little bit more. And so when psychedelics came on to sort of my radar when I was 19 or 20, yeah, I started to work with them intentionally and was like, wow, I'm having some of the most profound and insightful and beautiful experiences of my life. And so I was really inspired at that point in time to ask the question of how do we ensure that more people have access to this? And what can we learn from the past? What happened in the 60s that helps to inform what we need to do now. And so we went from my dad and my parents being sort of obliterated by the fact that I had smoked cannabis to fast forward about 12 years. In 2018, Michael Pollan's book came out. How many of you read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan? So a fair number of you. And my dad and I have a thing where he sends me a book to read and I'll read it, and then I send him a book to read and he'll read it. So I had been in the psychedelic space for a few years at that point in time, and I sent him this book to read. He read it, and he went from being horrified at the fact that I'd smoked weed to actually microdosing on psychedelics. And my dad is someone who's never been drunk, definitely never smoked weed. Went to seminary, very pious sort of man, and he tried microdosing. He called LSD his magic drops, and that actually created a great bridge. My dad's in his mid to late 60s at this point in time. A great bridge where about a year after that, he became open to doing a high dose of psilocybin. And so I guided him through a high dose psilocybin journey. And it was very profound and insightful for him. So to me, that speaks to sort of the power of microdosing. It speaks to the power of this medicine and what I've always focused on in my own work, but also, we have a training program for practitioners. We have a group coaching container where we're coaching people through a 6-week microdosing protocol. What I always emphasize is the importance that we walk the walk, right? That we first show up for ourselves, that we do our own work, that we face our own demons, and that we hold ourselves to the highest level of accountability as possible and responsibility. Because in doing that, then the way that we show up for our friends and family will transform those very relationships in and of themselves. So I just thought I'd share a little bit about my background, my story, so you have some context there. I'm curious, like, just before I maybe go into the details about microdosing that I think might be useful or helpful, what are some questions, whether they're more basic about microdosing or maybe somewhat more advanced? What are questions that either as you've embarked on your own protocols that have come up, questions that as you've been considering a protocol have come up, questions that you have about the research, questions that you have about the impact on the brain? I sort of came in at the end of this conversation about dreams, and I thought I'd share an interesting tidbit. They've done some interesting clinical research with LSD microdosing in New Zealand. And they've just finished phase 2 clinical trials. And in New Zealand, they're so chill over there that they let people just take the LSD home with them. So they set up a clinical trial where people can just take 10 micrograms of LSD and take it at home in their naturalistic setting. And they found, an increase in mood, an increase in energy, a significant reduction in depression, But the interesting thing that they found is it increased REM sleep by 20 minutes every night
Wow.
or on average the day after a microdose. And so REM is, of course, when we're dreaming. And there's been some really interesting research that's been done on this overlap between psychedelics and this relationship to REM. And so that also could be what's going on, is that the actual substance itself, for many of you, is amplifying the dreams because of the impact that it's having on your brain and neurochemistry. So
Cool.
I just thought I'd leave with that interesting tidbit. But I'd love to first know sort of what you all are curious about, what you want to learn about.
There's these unequivocal studies, and yet with microdosing, it seems like it's still a little bit on the ambiguous side. And I'm curious to know your thoughts or interpretations of why is it that the macrodose is just so, like, I mean, MDMA broke the scale, and then microdosing is still like, well, maybe. Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you might hear me reference history as part of some of our context today, and that's even where third wave, the name comes from. First wave of psychedelics being the ancient and indigenous use, and the second wave being the counterculture. And in the 1950s and 1960s, there were over 1,000 papers published on the clinical use of psychedelics, right? So we've had the clinical research, we've known the efficacy of psychedelics for a very long time. And there were two main ways that psychedelics were administered. One is what's called psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And that's a very high dose of a psychedelic done once or twice or even thrice, like with MDMA, with the intention being on a very profound, mystical, deep breakthrough experience, right? The ego dissolving aspect of psychedelics, this death and rebirth process, right? And so that's what a lot of the modern clinical research focuses on, because as you mentioned, Jay, the efficacy is um, it's so incredibly effective that regulators cannot ignore it, right? It's just like so profound. Now, there was also a second type of research done in the 50s and 60s, and this was called psycholytic dosing. And psycholytic dosing was when an individual took a low dose of a psychedelic and they did it once a week within a therapeutic container, right? And so I ended up replicating this in 2018. I saw a therapist in New York City for about 6 months. And before every therapeutic session that I went to, I would take about 200 milligrams of psilocybin. And for me, that's slightly perceptible, but still sub-intoxicating, right? So I can still get on the subway. I was living in Brooklyn at the time. I was going up to the Upper West Side. I could easily navigate that. But once I got in her office, there was a container where, with that 200 milligrams of psilocybin, it just was easier for me to access a lot of my emotions that were beneath the surface, the sadness and the anger and the grief and the shame and the disappointment that I was processing and working through in this therapeutic container. The psilocybin helped to open that up. The reason there hasn't been a lot of clinical research then on microdosing, and I hope you can see where I'm going with this, or on psilocybin, is because with the high dose psychedelic assisted therapy, it's once or twice and we see significant results. It's much less expensive in that way. With psycholytic dosing, they would try to track these outcomes instead of over just one or two experiences. It would be over maybe 3 months or 6 months or a year. And so because it's so still expensive to do research on psychedelics, a lot of the psycholytic dosing was sort of put to the wayside. Now, there is some interesting and new emerging research on microdosing. I would say and I'll give, maybe, would it be helpful, Jay, if I gave sort of both sides of it? Both what are we noticing from a benefit perspective, and what are we noticing from a maybe placebo? Is this placebo or not?
I think both are great in terms of viewing this as broadly as we possibly can. I mean, part of our agenda here in the Integrate community is education and wisdom of the big picture. So yeah, if we could do that
Right.
briefly, but I'd still love to get as many of people's questions answered as we can as well.
So I'll be very brief with this, or reasonably brief. there's been some initial clinical research done. I already mentioned the trial in LSD, elevation in mood, elevation in energy, drop in depression score, and increased sleep. That's 10 micrograms of LSD. That is, and this is really important to emphasize, that is the only clinical trial that is currently being done that reflects the way in which people are actually microdosing in a real world setting. All of the other clinical research that's been done has been, we give you a microdose once and let's see how it impacts you. But as many of us know, microdosing is not just taking a low dose once. It's about that protocol that's done over 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. The other really interesting research that was done was with Paul Stamets. How many of you know of Paul Stamets or have heard of Paul Stamets? Okay, so well-known mycologist, was on Fantastic Fungi, has been on Joe Rogan, came up with something called the Stamets stack, which is psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so there are 6 different protocols on the page that I linked earlier, including the Stamets stack. If people are curious about what those protocols are, you can just get them at that top link where it says connected psychedelics.
Correct. Yep. So the Stamets stack. And Paul did a really cool trial with an app with this group out of Vancouver called Quantified Citizen. And he basically said, everyone who's microdosing at home, just track and measure your mood, track and measure your energy on a day-to-day basis using this app. And so they got data from like 10,000 people. And again, what they found in that research was that psilocybin microdosing helped with mood, helped with energy, and helped to reduce depression, right? So we're noticing some interesting overlaps and parallels with some of this emergent clinical research. And so now we get into the question of why, right? Why is this helpful with our mood? Why is this helpful with energy? Why is this helpful at navigating depression? And the crux of it is because of the impact that it's having on serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. And so those are the 3 main neurotransmitters: serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. And the way that it impacts is very different than SSRIs. So SSRIs blunt our emotional response, which can be very useful initially. But as many of us know, how many people here have been on an SSRI in the past? Okay. How many of you know maybe or have a friend or family member who has been on SSRIs at some point? Okay, wow. For those of you who don't, kudos. That's great. I did a call earlier today with our practitioner community. We had 35 people there. Every single person put up their hand in terms of they know a friend or a family. Both of my sisters are on SSRIs as an example. They could be really useful for the first 3 or 6 months, but what we now know through clinical research is that SSRIs are actually no more effective than placebo. Both work about 40% of the time. And so what microdosing does, and there's a lot of reason for that, which I won't go into now, but what microdosing does is it actually opens up this window, and psychedelics generally do this, but they open up this window of neuroplasticity, this window of openness, you can think of it as. And that allows for something called catharsis. And so the what I was describing before, where I took 200 milligrams of psilocybin and I went into a therapeutic container, there was catharsis of negative emotions. And so in that relief, there is a spaciousness that's cleared, which allows for more presence, more contentment, a better mood, more energy, a reduction in depression, all these sorts of things. And so that catharsis, that a capacity to feel, that attunement to our true emotional state is where microdosing can really help us to better understand what's really going on with me. How am I really feeling? Not just consciously, not just here, but really here, right? In the body and in the heart. And so it opens up that window. And so then when we do it, think of it as when we do it 2 or 3 times a week over a period of 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, there's a cumulative impact on that neuroplasticity. The best parallel is like mindfulness meditation. How many of you have some sort of meditation practice that you commit to or you've done in the past? Okay, about half of you. So they've shown with brain scans that after 6 weeks of meditation every day for 6 weeks, there's more gray matter that's developed in the brain, right? Which means it's more plastic. But that's not just after one day. It's not like you sit on a cushion, you meditate for 20 minutes and you're enlightened. It takes that practice of 6 weeks. So the best way to think about microdosing is this is a skill. This is a practice that we cultivate that helps us to become more free, more open, more present, and more capable of navigating life with agency, sovereignty, and choice.
Love that. I would love to go down a rabbit hole here related to the studies. I think it was on Huberman Lab. They were interviewing, his name escapes me right the second, and he was just talking about the questionable, but I did not realize that there was only one study and that it wasn't well structured. So are there, given your sort of finger on the pulse of these things, are there more microdosing formal studies that are getting underway in terms of demonstrating the efficacy of this?
Yeah. So, like I said, there's this company, Mind Biotherapeutics, that is kicking off the phase 2B trial now. There are a couple others that are doing, like Paul Stamets has a life sciences company where he's doing proper clinical trials with the Stamets stack, the psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin. And then there's one
patent for that, actually, right?
And he also was able to get a patent for that.
He got it. I thought he just applied. Okay.
He got it. He was approved. And I did a podcast with him about a year and a half ago. So if you want to go and do a deep dive on the Stamets stack and microdosing and neurogenesis and all that, you can listen to the podcast that I did with Paul Stamets. Those are the two most prominent. There's a couple others that are out there, but honestly, most of the emphasis in microdosing is with natural psilocybin mushrooms. And a lot of it is just happening in the underground at this point in time. And so the key is, how do we generate data from that use and utility to look at how microdosing is impacting people? But it's still very expensive, and I think there was a lot of money that came into the psychedelic ecosystem in the biotech space in 2020 and 2021, but a lot of it dried up in 2022 and 2023, and we're now again this year seeing sort of a revival. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next year to 2 years we start to see a lot more research that starts to be carried out on these low doses of psychedelics. The parallel that I would draw is, as there are quite a few folks who, when they start to microdose, they're hoping for, obviously, to have more energy, to have a better mood, to feel less depressed. But what some of them notice is they actually, microdosing, for better or worse, makes them confront certain emotions and feelings that have just been stuffed below the surface. It could be that, with the intention being to feel safe and to cultivate safety, that your dreamscape is showing, it's essentially expanding your awareness in terms of all the ways in which you haven't felt safe. The way that you can navigate it to create an existence that ensures that none of those aspects are no longer present. And so this is what we talk about. I have this sort of model of transformation that I talk about in terms of the skill of psychedelics. And awareness is the first pillar that we talk about. And a lot of people think of awareness and they think of enlightenment and they think of bliss and they think of joy and they think of awareness of oneness and connection and God and, all these sorts of things. But there's a reason that Aldous Huxley would talk about psychedelic being both heaven and hell, right? That when we open these doors of perception, even at just a microdose, it could open these realms, especially in our dream world. I think that's a really interesting example, that show us all of the ways in which we don't want to live, because that is a fundamental aspect of our duality. Without light, there's no dark. Without up, there's no down. Without bad, there's no good. And so there could be in such a way where you're starting to see, oh, those are all the ways that I don't feel safe. And by coming into that awareness, I'm actually able to better understand how I cultivate safety in my everyday waking existence. let's first zoom out and look at what is the actual difference between psilocybin and LSD, right? Because these are two different compounds.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm going to zoom out even further a little bit. So bear with me, everyone, but I think this will be helpful context for all the folks here. The classic psychedelics are tryptamines, lysergamides, and phenethylamines. The psilocybin, but DMT is also a tryptamine, both NN-DMT, which is an ayahuasca, and 5-MeO-DMT, tryptamine. Lysergamides are LSD, is the most common lysergamide. And the most common phenethylamine is mescaline, which is found in San Pedro and peyote. Now, San Pedro is a really interesting substance to microdose with. I've done it a little bit myself, but just for the sake of time and focus, we'll focus on LSD and psilocybin for the time being. So the core difference between a tryptamine, which is psilocybin, and LSD, which is a lysergamide, is tryptamines are more active with serotonin. So they're more serotonergic. There's more serotonin that is tied to psilocybin. And what that means is psilocybin tends to be a bit more somatic, emotional, feeling oriented. And I say tends to be because N equals 1, people do have a different experience, but it tends to open up more of a somatic, therapeutic, feeling, emotional container. It's only about a 4 to 5 hour overall experience, meaning the half-life is, between 3 to 4 hours. And it tends to be a little less activating and stimulating compared to psilocybin. And so usually what I tell folks is if you want to microdose and your intention is to wean off pharmaceutical medications like Prozac or Zoloft or Lexapro, if you are sick of just, maybe you're on other psychiatric medications and you're like, I don't want to do anything synthetic. I just want to work with a natural sort of plant and fungi. That's also a great way to reestablish a healthy relationship with medicine. Or if you want to do sort of deeper emotional processing or therapeutic work, I find psilocybin microdosing to be really useful for that. LSD and lysergamides generally are more dopaminergic, more dopamine, right? And dopamine is focus, attention, and motivation. It's also related to extroversion. LSD lasts twice as long as psilocybin. So it's about 10 to 12 hours instead of 5 to 6 hours. Because of its impact on dopamine, it's much more stimulating. So for protocols, I tell folks with LSD, probably best to do it maximum twice a week. Maximum twice a week. Because if you do it more often than that, it can start to cause sort of a state of mania, of becoming a bit manic, if you will. Whereas psilocybin, you can do it 3 or 4 times a week without feeling sort of overwhelmed or like it's too much. And then when it comes to the intention, a lot of folks microdose LSD if they are looking, for me, I'm a good example of this. When I started microdosing LSD many years ago with my first protocol, I wanted to drink less alcohol, so it got totally off alcohol because LSD helps with extroversion. This is its impact on dopamine. It helps with extroversion, right? And I wanted to be more in sort of a focused flow state when I was working on a book that I was writing. And again, because of that impact on attention, focus, and motivation, I find LSD is really good for cognition, really good for flow states. So it's more of a I want to go out and do something in the world. So LSD can help with that. And so my perspective on do we mix and match? Do we try both or just stick with one? The advice that I always give is first establish a relationship with one substance, right? So you just did a 6-week protocol with psilocybin. Great. You're now on an off cycle. You kind of know how that worked. You know what went well, what maybe didn't go so well, your dosage, your calibration. Well, how does 5 micrograms feel? How does 10 micrograms feel? How does 15 micrograms feel? This is what I call calibrate for a 6-week period, taking a couple weeks off, and then going, okay, now it might be interesting to mix and match, right? But you want to have a good sense of how you relate to each one of the substances before you start to weave them into a container. My perspective there would be, we'll see. It's a great experiment to run, but at the end of the day, it's it, once you do it, you'll know, and then you'll be able to see, like, I wear the Aura Ring, for example, or if you wear a Fitbit or whatever that is, you'll actually be able to see, okay, I microdosed with LSD for these last 6 weeks. Let's see how that compares to when I was microdosing with psilocybin for 6 weeks, and see if I was able to get better sleep as a result.
We talked about the Aura Ring, and I know a bunch of our members actually bought one, like Trish just got hers. If you're
Nice.
going to do that, set a tag for the days where you do, similar like a workout, so that when you're going back to look at the data, you can actually sort through and filter. It took me a while to figure that out. It's like, oh, this was a microdose day, and I wanted to make sure I put a tag in on those days and I could sort them better. So that instead of going through one at a time, what day was it, comparing with my calendar, all that BS.
Tend to feel more extroverted, more social, more outgoing, like kind of wanting to get out, and I think it's because of its impact on dopamine. It's what's the dependency like? And as we know, physiologically, there's no dependency, which is great. That's definitely an upgrade from SSRIs and ADHD medications, that you can microdose 2 or 3 times a week, and you can stop for 2 or 3 weeks, and you're not going to have any physical withdrawals whatsoever. But the question of psychologically, how might that impact me, is a very legitimate question. And I think there's a few ways to think about it. One is, remember that microdosing is a catalyst because of its impact on neuroplasticity, and really have a focused intention, and most importantly, at least one practice that you're committing to that's part of that microdosing protocol. So in other words, as an example, let's say you kick off a 6-week microdosing protocol, and you're like, okay, as part of this, I really want to utilize this space to meditate for 15 minutes every day. And I want to integrate or implement this as a practice, because by the end of those 6 weeks, it'll be a habit. And so then I know after those 6 weeks, I can have an off cycle with the psilocybin, but I still have meditation as that daily habit, that daily practice that's going to still help to sort of ward off the demons, if you will. So I think that's kind of and you could fill that in with yoga, you could fill that in with a nature walk, you could fill that in with breath work, you could fill that in with cold plunging, you could, like, there's a lot of other practices that we can cultivate. I'm just preferential to meditation as sort of like a really fundamental core keystone habit. I think the science on it is incredible. And it's very, very useful. So I'd say that's piece number one. I'd say piece number two is, I know a lot of folks who still use psilocybin as a prophylactic against depression, meaning they go in a microdosing protocol, they potentially wean off Prozac and Zoloft, and their intention is to microdose 2 or 3 times a week for the foreseeable future. They will do off cycles still every 6 weeks. They'll take a week or 2 weeks off, but it really is a medicine, or a supplement is another way to frame it, that they find is just physiologically beneficial. And so another way to think about it is, I'm a big supplement junkie. So I got my qualia, which you can't see because I have this weird background thing going on. I have my probiotics, I have my magnesium, I have my lion's mane and cordyceps. I take creatine every day, I take fish oil every day, right? I don't see those as being drugs. I see those as being just, I'm helping to fill in certain gaps because our soil isn't as good as it used to be. So I have to take magnesium. We have seed oils in a lot of our food now, so I need fish oil to balance it, right? And think of microdosing even as sort of a neurological vitamin, right? And that it may just be useful to cultivate that as a practice. Again, still have these off cycles, but also don't be afraid to really establish a deep relationship with it, and look to it as an ally in that process of healing. I think part of the framing then in that, Jason, it's a very reasonable concern. Like, I want to emphasize and acknowledge that it's a very reasonable concern. And what I found in these contexts or cases for folks who may have this preponderance is a high dose followed by microdosing, or microdosing as prep in leading up to a high dose. Because as probably almost all of us can attest to, or at least most of us, a high dose of psilocybin has no addictive potential because the courage required to go into that space is definitely not something that you want to do every so often, right? So almost look at the high dose as a yeah, it's sort of like a, and I use this term very loosely, like a vaccine against the sort of psychological dependence. Like it really reminds you of the power of what you're working with and the respect and reverence that these plants and fungi are asking for as we're in relationship with them.
I love that, and I want to just interject really quickly. And Jason, I know you and I have talked about this already, but part and parcel of us launching the gummy line for microdosing is to provide I'm going to say it, a backstop or an integration tool or a continued opening after the connection experience that really provides another layer of depth and process, exactly as Paul was talking about. So that's quite frankly why that exists, as we've been developing the processes to support people between experiences.
So there's been some really interesting clinical research on the impact of psychedelics on inflammation. The researcher who's doing this or has carried this out is a guy named Charles Nichols, and he's done this research at LSU. And he specifically has studied a substance called DOI, which is a synthetic. And the closest natural substance to DOI is mescaline, back to phenethylamine. And so what we are looking at, and this is very, I want to kind of couch this as what I'm communicating is speculative still, because there really hasn't been much, if any, research on microdosing for gut health. But my hypothesis is the reason microdosing seems to have this holistic and global impact on someone's overall wellness is because of its impact on inflammation. And as many of us know, chronic inflammation is related to so many lifestyle diseases, right? And so if we can take a substance consistently that helps to lower inflammation in the gut, there's also a direct relationship to its impact on the brain because of the vagus nerve and the gut-brain axis. When we lower inflammation in the gut, we're also creating more neuroplasticity in the brain. And so that's where I go. If we know psychedelics and microdosing helps with BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is the precursor to neuroplasticity, very, very likely that it's also doing something in the gut. And my hypothesis is that San Pedro, in particular, if this is an intention, is the optimal substance to microdose with as it relates to inflammation. Psilocybin helps, LSD helps, but they're both not as effective as San Pedro in that process. What is it, the second brain or the third brain, something like that, that we know? So yeah, about 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut. And that's why, like, even looking at microdosing as a catalyst, as an activator to change our lifestyle patterns and behaviors, right? A lot of us, and myself included, I take all these supplements, like, we sometimes do things on the periphery without really focusing on actually the most fundamental things. And the most fundamental things are diet, exercise, sleep. Are you eating well? Are you moving? And are you sleeping? And of course, there's sunshine and there's relationships in there. But those are really what almost all physiological health comes back to. And so really looking at microdosing as a catalyst, more energy, better mood, less depression, as you can likely imagine, people who experience that are more likely then to work out. They're more likely to make better dietary decisions. They're more likely to really honor themselves and get good sleep. So it really is a cumulative process, I would say, overall.
I love that. Paul, I know that my particular crew could keep you busy for the next 7.5 days.
Well, we'll have to we should definitely do a round 2 at some point, because this has been a lot of fun and you have a great crew here, very active. And I can see everyone, and it's great to see everyone's attention and presence. And so I really appreciate that as well. I know it's very easy to get distracted and check email and check phones, but I really appreciate everyone being so attentive with this. So
our crew is engaged and leaning in and committed, and literally everyone on this call has been like deep in their healing process and their evolution and their exploration for months and years. So yeah, we'd love to have you back, and we will. I guess my last question is this: you have a beautifully structured, and by the way, gang, I'm just going to do a little sidebar here, is that when Paul and I first met, we sort of dove into talking about certification programs and curriculum design. And of course, my background in curriculum design, they designed really great courses. And part and parcel of why I wanted Paul here was to share about the 45-day microdose experience that is coming up. And I know you got to get back in fairly short span of time. So I thought maybe let's
5-10 minutes.
we do that. You can tell us about that. And if people want to participate, I'll put the link in there. And then we maybe have time for one or two more questions.
Perfect. Yeah. So thanks for teeing that up, Jay. So for the last few years, we've opened up a group coaching container where I coach essentially a group of individuals through a 6-week microdosing protocol. And so we have different focal points. 1 week we focus on awareness, another week we focus on, physical wellness, flow and creativity, relationships, right? So we have a very structured 6-week microdosing protocol that we take you through. Sourcing will not be a problem for any of you because you're in Jay's community, but we also do support on that if it's necessary. And we meet once a week. Think of it as it's a container like this. And I'm teaching and answering questions. And then, of course, as you all can imagine, one of the best parts is you get to connect with even more incredible folks who are also on a path of healing and transformation themselves and start to build out or continue to build out your own mycelial network within this microdosing experience. And so we start the next one in about 2 weeks. We have our kickoff call April 15th, and we have the first group coaching session on the 22nd. And like I said, that's a 6-week protocol. We have usually anywhere from, it's about this size. So, 25 to 30 to 35 people will show up live for the group sessions. And we just go deep into microdosing and basically any and all questions that come up, whether it's your first protocol or your 10th protocol. The intention is just to help you to calibrate your dose level, dial in that intention, develop your community, and just support you on this path of healing and transformation. Packages, there's like a low, mid-tier, and kind of premium. The low is just like you get access to all the curriculum, but not the group coaching. So we drip you the curriculum over the 6 weeks. You get a workbook, you get sort of the other things, but you're just doing this on your own. You can still access people in the community and ask questions. The mid is the group coaching container. That's, access to the group coaching for those 6 weeks, including not including a kickoff and a closing call. So it's actually 8 weeks in total. And then the sort of premium is it includes one-to-one work with me. So it's essentially like if you want to get the group coaching and you want to have a couple one-on-one sessions with me, we'll go deep into your microdosing protocols, your practices, anything that I can support you one-on-one with as it relates to psychedelics, healing, transformation. I will do that. So that's probably the simplest and easiest way to describe those three. And I would say the sort of practical benefit to it is supporting you within your microdosing protocol for calibration, for which medicine you want to dose with or microdose with, for anything that comes up in that process that you need to navigate. And then a lot of people love the community of folks that they connect with and they learn from as part of that container. But I would say calibration, intention, and then naturally things come up in that process. And so just having an expert to bounce questions off of as you navigate your microdosing.
So in my humble opinion, just going back to this idea of what you're going to do, it's the group coaching and it's the access to the experience that makes all the difference in the world. So in my humble opinion, I'd be doing the middle package or above. Just my opinion.
To be like a 1 day on, 1 day off protocol with psilocybin twice and LSD once. But if you're going to microdose both, I think start with probably 2 psilocybin microdose days and 1 LSD microdosing day. If you have a high dose journey coming up, I usually advise folks to take at least a week off microdosing prior to that high dose journey, just to help reset tolerance. 48-hour window of short-term tolerance. But if you have a journey on a Saturday, I usually tell people start microdosing on that Tuesday or Wednesday, like pretty much right after, because you want to get in as soon as possible to keep that window of neuroplasticity open with microdosing. I love Qualia. It's my favorite. I love Neurohacker and the team at Neurohacker. The Qualia without caffeine is like my favorite nootropic. And I often combine it with microdoses. I saw this question from Vera. And so I just, from cognitive performance, it's killer. I bet I haven't found anything as good as it. Perspective is like start with the psilocybin microdosing. Usually that's what I advise as a first starting point, psilocybin every other day. Day with psilocybin, 100 milligrams to start, and then sort of slowly go up 100, see how that feels, 150, see how that feels, 200, see how that feels, right? Because you're also trying to get a sense of calibration and what the appropriate dose level is. A week before I'd say a week before any medicine work is helpful when it comes to microdosing, including the connection experience. That would be my advice.
100%. All right. This is it.
All right,
then.
folks, this was fun. If you have any questions for us, reach out. Podcast we have, private community we have, the microdosing experience. But this has been great. Jay, thank you. Corey, thank you for
Thank
the
you, Paul.
invitation.